All right, it's 12:01 according to my clock, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the weekly virtual seminar of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Today, we have a very exciting speaker, one of our visiting scholars for the year, Maiko Ichihara, who is a professor at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, and this year has been a visiting scholar with CDDRL, working on issues of democracy promotion and Japanese foreign policy. In September, Maiko is going to be moving to Washington, D.C. to be a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's someone with extensive scholarly as well as policy experience. And if you have any questions during the course of her talk, remember that you are free to type them into the chat box or to the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get to them during the discussion that will follow her talk. Thank you so much. And Maiko, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Today, I would like to focus on Japanese foreign policy, which is my focus of research. The liberal international order, which comprises such values as democracy, human rights, freedom, and the rule of law, has been under a serious challenge since the 2000s, and even more so under the current COVID pandemic. And together with the weakened symbolic position of the United States under President Trump as a supporter of democracy and the liberal international order as a whole, there is an increased necessity for other democratic countries to think about their roles in supporting democracy and the liberal international order. And that's out of this sense of emergency that this book, which I show in the slide, The Crisis of Liberal Internationalism, was published earlier this year, which is edited by Yoji Funabashi and John Eikenberry. And I wrote a chapter to this book, and so today's content is mainly from this book chapter. And when we think what kind of roles and values have played in Japanese foreign policy, the existing literature mainly focus on the security aspect. There's a vast amount of existing literature that talks about the role of pacifism, anti-militarism, or anti-traditionalism, and their impacts onto Japanese security policy, and how it has limited Japanese presence in the security realm. However, given the slight change in Japanese security posture after the end of the Cold War, some scholars such as Bhupinder Sen focuses on this change aspect. And Singh, for example, argues that the change of norms from peace state norm to international state norm have prompted Japan to change its security policy. However, these existing literature mainly focuses on the security aspect, and it does not talk about the values that Japan has reflected on its diplomacy, and also Japan has promoted abroad. And thus, today I would like to raise these three research questions. What kind of values has Japan supported in its diplomacy after the World War II? And whether there's any consistency in it or not. And secondly, given that it's been, especially under Prime Minister Abe's administration, that the Japanese government brought values to the forefront of diplomacy, I would like to raise the question of how has values diplomacy evolved under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administrations. And based on these analyses, lastly, I would like to mention what should Japan do to support the development of liberal democracies in the Asia Pacific. My argument would look like this. I'm not good at visualizing, but the three people on the left-hand side sort of represents universal values of democracy and human rights. And during the Cold War, what these values functioned in the Japanese diplomacy, foreign policy as a whole, was to prevent the Japanese state from falling into militarism once again. And they did not have enough dynamo to push the Japanese state to promote values beyond its borders. However, after the end of the Cold War, it started promoting values abroad, but not as universal values, but much more pluralistic or diversified values have been promoted. Some scholars of democracy support consider Japan as a successful case where military intervention implanted democracy. However, indeed, although that's one aspect of Japanese democracy, but we have to note that there were voices which required democracy and civil liberties within the society even before the U.S. implanted democracy, which managed to sustain democracy and consolidate democracy in the country. And that voice came from Japanese experiences during the Pacific Wars, Japanese militarism, which led the country to colonization of other Asian countries, and also the constraints on civil societies placed within the society caused suspicion of the military as an institution in the post-World War II period, and people started longing for freedom of speech, media freedom, and freedom of assembly. And these voices caused pacifism, anti-militarism, democracy, and civil liberties as values shared amongst the Japanese public and function as constraints for Japanese security policies, as the existing literature argued. And not only did people start voicing their wantings for civil liberties, but also they started calling for Japan's total demilitarization, neutrality between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and discard of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And these voices, especially from the left politicians of the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and intellectuals, were so strong that mainstream politicians could not ignore. And thus, they needed to adjust themselves to form what we call the Yoshida Doctrine, which is that Japan relies its security on the US-Japan alliance and limits its military presence while focusing on economic development. So this means that these pacifist constraints formed Japanese security policies in a way to sort of restrain Japanese security presence in the international scene. And these pacifist constraints remain until today. But beyond this, Japan did not move to promote democracies during the Cold War period. However, changes came around the Cold War's end. The fact that former communist countries democratized was already a sign for the Japanese as well, that democracy became a shared norm. And it was such a timing that the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred, and thus it caused a split in the domestic opinion in Japan. While some people thought that democracy and human rights should be upheld, and thus Japan should apply sanctions to China, but others, especially in the business sector, considered that Japan should maintain window for dialogue with China, and thus Japan should take an engagement measure. And this split caused slow reaction on the side of Japan, in addition to contradictory sort of reaction. Japan applied economic sanction to China eventually, but it swiftly moved to persuade other G7 countries to lift the sanctions as soon as possible. And such a slow and contradictory reactions were due to the lack of policy on democracy and human rights in Japan. And this was seriously felt and shared amongst the policymakers, and moved them to create policy on it, especially culminating in the creation of the Official Development Assistance Charter in 1992. Another trigger came at the time of the Gulf War. Japan could not dispatch the self-defense force to the coalition to fight against Iraq due to the constitutional constraints or pacifism constraints. And instead, Japan provided financial support little by little, accumulating to the $13 billion. But criticism came both from international society and domestic society that Japan's financial support was too little too late. And when the Kuwaiti government advertised a thank you note in multiple newspapers, the Kuwaiti government did not list the name of Japan. So the Japanese policymakers and politicians considered that it shows the lack of recognition for Japanese checkbook diplomacy. So in a sense, this was a case where Pacific norm constraints led to diplomatic defeat. And from that time on, there evolved discussions within the domestic society as to what kind of international cooperation Japan should make, which shows Japanese face in order to win respect and recognition. And there appeared two prominent proposals for Japan. One was from Ichiro Ozawa, then Secretary General of the Liberal Democratic Party, who argued that Japan should become a normal country and Japan should dispatch self-defense force to UN peacekeeping operations. Japan indeed enacted law which facilitated the dispatch of the SDF and has been continuing dispatching SDF to peacekeeping operations. But due to the constraints of Pacific norms, there has been some restraints, limitations in this type of international cooperation. For example, there has been discussions up until today as to where SDF can be deployed, whether they can defend themselves with the use of weapons and so forth. And thus, while there's limitations as to what Japan can do in the security realm, different type of proposal came from Yoichi Funabashi, then editor-in-chief at Asahi Shimbun newspaper, and the current president of the think tank called the Asia Pacific Initiative. And he argued that Japan should become a global civilian power, which means that Japan should contribute in the areas where Japan has already accumulated experience, which are political and economic sectors. In other words, it was the proposal that Japan should do the middle power diplomacy. And because this type of contribution, international contribution, does not conflict with Pacific norm constraints because it's not in the security realm. So Japan indeed expanded its international cooperation in this direction. That's how Japan started providing legal assistance, governance assistance, for example, in the 1990s. And also it began applying economic sanctions at the time of serious human rights violations. So it means that this proposal prompted Japan to promote values abroad. Another type of push came in the 2000s when international structural change occurred. China's rise made the Japanese policymakers feel the necessity to differentiate Japan's foreign policy from China's. What I mean is that China being an economic superpower began using its economic cooperation as one of the main tools in its diplomacy. And as a country which has been using ODA for its diplomatic purposes, Japan felt the necessity to differentiate Japanese diplomacy from China's. And US relative decline also increased doubt amongst the Japanese policymakers and the public in US commitment to the security of Japan. Thus, they started considering the necessity to expand its alignment beyond the US-Japan alliance, and they also started considering the necessity to play roles to maintain the status quo where Japan has vested interest, and the status quo is the liberal international order. And that was how Japan brought democracy, human rights, freedom, and the rule of law as universal values that Japan supports with its diplomatic actions. And the reason why Japan brought these values of universal values was because with emphasizing these values, Japan can differentiate itself from China, and also Japan can win the hearts and minds of other democratic countries and emphasize sort of we feeling. And that was how the first Abe administration launched the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity Initiative in 2006, seeking to expand Japan's security partners with the banners of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And it also claimed that it would support democracy abroad. And indeed, Japan expanded security cooperation with India and Australia beyond the US-Japan alliance, and provided fund for the UN Democracy Fund, for example. But criticism came to Japan, especially from China and Russia, due to the fact that this arc was supposed to surround Russia and China. And so this Arc of Freedom and Prosperity Initiative was considered to be a containment strategy. And together with the fact that first Abe administration was short-lived, there was not much substance out of this initiative. However, when Prime Minister Abe came back to the prime ministership in December 2012, he brought values-based diplomacy to the forefront of Japanese diplomacy once again. It took the same line of initiative. It was the same line of initiative as the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, and it expanded with this line. Japan expanded security relations with other democratic countries such as UK and France, and expanded external support for liberal causes. However, in supporting other countries for liberal causes, Japan took a somewhat unique approach compared to other Western countries, which is that Japan took a much more long-term approach. Japan considered that stability and safety in the society is also important, even in the process of democratic reform. And so it took a sort of indirect approach to democracy support. And much more than that, what impacted sort of the Japanese diplomacy was complaints from Southeast Asia. Complaints came from China as well, but from Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries complained that the more Japan emphasizes democracy and human rights, the more Japan manages to differentiate itself from China, and the more they feel that they are forced to choose between Japan and China. And so they requested Japan to sort of decrease the tone emphasis on democracy and human rights. And so Japan gradually took that approach and gradually started diversifying the values that they would mention and they would try to promote. And so eventually the Japanese government started emphasizing the rule of law, accountability, openness, and these sort of pluralistic approach. And this pluralistic approach was culminated with the arrival of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2017, which was based on Prime Minister Abe's speech in 2016, where the term democracy was dropped. Which is counterintuitive when thinking that the terms freedom and openness naturally imply that it's about democracy. But the Japanese government did not claim that it was about democracy. Their message was that Japan would expand support for the rule of law, freedom of navigation, free trade, accountability, transparency, and financial health, and so forth. And so that it was a message that Japan does not force others to choose between Japan and China. And this kind of diversification of values over time can be, I think, captured and supported by my correspondence analysis. I conducted correspondence analysis on foreign ministers' statements in press conferences using a software called KH Coder. The terms that appear near the coordinate axis, which is the crossing of the two dotted lines, or the terms that have been used throughout the period of 1995 to 2016. And the terms that appear far away from the coordinate axis are the terms that appeared particularly to the years that are shown near the terms. And so it shows that some terms like humanitarianism on the right top side, human rights on the left side, and freedom on the bottom right are terms that were intensively used in specific years. And those terms were used in relations with specific crises or incidents. However, in that sense, those terms appeared as outliers. But other than that, those terms as democracy and peace continuously used throughout the period from between 1995 and 2016. But in addition to that, you can see that these terms such as transparency and the rule of law began being used around mid-2000s. And so Japan started diversifying the values that it talks about and it promotes abroad. So my conclusions are threefold. One is that functions of liberal values multiplied over time. And while during the Cold War period, liberal values functioned as constraints onto Japanese security, and that function actually remains until today. But in the post-Cold War period, another function was added, which was to promote values abroad. And this change occurred, which is the second point. This change occurred due to Japan's security concerns and intention to expand diplomatic influence. And so those motivations were pragmatic. And thirdly, receiving criticisms from China, Russia, and other Southeast Asian countries, in addition to from domestic public, these trials and errors led the Japanese government to diversify the values that they emphasize and promote. And this is the last slide. Based on this analysis, I would like to make 4 policy recommendations. Although Japan has been promoting values abroad in the post-Cold War period, there some occasionally lacks consistency in its messages. So Japan should bring much more consistency to its diplomatic moves and uphold liberal values. Secondly, the current direction, diplomatic direction of promoting diversified values or pluralistic values is a sort of low-key approach, and it's feasible for Japan. So Japan should continue pursuing this low-key approach. But in order to do so, the umbrella strategy of a free and open Indo-Pacific might not really fit. So Japan, it might be desirable for Japan to gradually decrease the mention and use of the umbrella concept of the FOIP. Thirdly, Japan also should expand support through multilateral institutions for much more direct democratic reforms. And finally, it's the civil society which is the dynamo for democratization and democratic movements. And so Japan should expand support for civil society. That's it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, Maiko, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. We're getting some comments just saying thank you for this really interesting discussion. So I wanted to start by asking about some of the domestic determinants of foreign policy in this period. As you rightly note, the 90s was a time after the Cold War when many countries shifted their priorities about democracy and human rights. But Japan also, after experiencing tremendous growth through the 80s, has experienced somewhat lower growth rates over the past few decades. There are crises or at least problems related to demography and birth rates. And recently, I think the government has been experimenting with potentially importing labor and allowing greater levels of what they're not calling immigration, but basically foreigners to come work, which is a new policy for the Japanese government. So do you have any thoughts about how some of these domestic factors have also shaped the willingness of the government to change its foreign policy positions?
Probably not much impact is casted from these domestic changes. Yeah, as I talked about, or the time that Japan changed its foreign aid behavior was in the 1990s, and it was before Japan's sort of change in terms of these foreign labors, and before the demographic change was seriously felt amongst the public. And so it was more about reputation, how Japan should make a role, gain reputation internationally.
Okay, excellent. So we have a question from Jamie O'Connell asking about pro-democracy Japanese policies that are aimed at Asia, like Myanmar, have faced many obstacles, like maybe a thin commitment to democratic values in the region. And whereas how has democracy promotion in other places been received? So for example, are there cases in Africa or in other regions of the world where Japanese democracy promotion has been more successful, or has it entered into collaborations with other partners, including the United States or the EU?
Thank you for that question. Well, indeed, when it comes to Myanmar, Japan is facing difficulty on how to support democratization or further liberalization in the country. But I think interesting case would be Cambodia. Japan faced a very serious sort of challenge in 2018 when the Cambodian government abolished the Rescue Party, which is a major opposition party, and disbanded some of the media outlets in the country and conducted election, which was far right from free and fair. And Japan already dispatched, sent some materials for elections, and Japan was also to send election monitoring team. But there was a serious discussion within the Japanese policy circle as to whether Japan really should send this election monitoring team, because the US and other European countries already withdrew from election monitoring. And if Japan was to send it, then Japan might feel that it has to eventually endorse the election, because if the election itself is conducted free and fair. And so eventually they withdrew. They did not send election monitoring team. And from that time on, out of that experience, there was a serious discussion as to how Japan should support or push Cambodia toward liberalization and democratization. And since that time on, Japan started inviting politicians from both the governing party and the opposition party from Cambodia once a quarter or so. Japan let them have dialogue between themselves and observe Japanese congressional meetings and election pollings and those democracy-related aspects. And so Cambodia is a very interesting case that Japan changed its support, and Japan is now seriously considering how more to do.
Okay. Great. We have a question from Larry Diamond that's similar to a question from Steve Krasner. Larry's asking, what is Japan doing to counter PRC disinformation or to sharpen power projection in the region? And Steve Krasner asks how much of the support for values by the Japanese government is driven by concerns about China versus by domestic politics or, you know, new foreign policy commitments. So could you speak a little bit more to the China-Japan relationship and geopolitics in the region?
Sure. China factor is the most difficult one for Japan to tackle. Disinformation is not strongly, awareness about disinformation is not strongly shared amongst the Japanese public, which is a serious issue from my point of view. Mainly because China is not infiltrated with disinformation to the extent that it has been doing in the American society or Australia or Taiwan or Hong Kong. And so it's not been too much an issue. But of course, there is a awareness that China has been doing that in those areas. And but when it comes to tackling, countering this disinformation, Japan is not has not I would say created any efficient sort of policy. And especially up until recently, because Xi Jinping was to visit Japan in April, so the Japanese government basically did not want to touch up on China-related issues. And so they were very quiet about protests in Hong Kong and so forth. With the rising activity of China's soft power during the COVID-19, we have to see what kind of changes Japan will take.
Okay. Given, we have colleagues at CDDRL like Larry Diamond who have written about a democratic recession around the world. Not only are many countries becoming less democratic, but also, as you rightly noted, support for democracy and traditional democracy promotion efforts by the sort of advanced democracies has also been in decline. Do you think that Japan sees an opportunity to become more of a global leader on those issues, or do you see some trends that are in line with what we see more broadly around the globe?
I don't think that Japan will try to become a world leader in supporting democracy abroad, but Japan would, I would say, be interested in playing a leadership role in the support of free trade. You can see in the examples of Comprehensive Pacific Partnership, CPP. And after the U.S. withdrew from this free trade agreement, Japan took the leadership of leading to the agreement. And also recently, there was a collective statement from WTO, including Japan, that we should support free trade of PPE, medical related goods, which is oftentimes restricted from exporting from especially countries that are seriously hit by the COVID pandemic. And so I think those free trade related areas or some areas that Japan is interested in. Japan thinks it can take some leadership. But when it comes to democracy related issues, Japan feels more comfortable in being low-key. And even though Japan can expand financial support and the amount itself in its support, but it would not claim to become a leader.
Okay. We have a question from Frank Fukuyama asking, despite Abe's supposed values-based foreign policy, or what you've rightly shown has been the values that he's laid out, Abe is also known as a nationalist who may sometimes have somewhat faltering democratic commitments. So which part of Japanese society and civil society that you've been studying is the most committed to democratic values and to the promotion of democratic values through foreign policy? What do you think this says about the left in Japan?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, that's a very interesting point indeed to mention. Um, Abe is very good at presenting liberal sort of picture to the outside external world, but well, he's indeed well, under his administration, the media freedom has been decreased, and also there have been weakened check and balance. Recently, the role of judiciary has been under serious attack, and so well, he's not well supporter of liberal values himself, but well, the Oracle Freedom and Prosperity Initiative well, came with the help of speechwriter Tomohiko Taniguchi, who is a professor at Keio University in Tokyo. Well, he has been helping sort of framing Japanese diplomacy in a way to appeal to the international public and also, as I said, to differentiate from China. And so this is a sort of discourse sort of war. And as to who are the real supporters of those liberal causes, as far as I know, it's the opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party have members who are very much interested in the progress of democracy, especially in Southeast Asia. And yet, well, they are not necessarily widespread. They think that, especially under the administration, the democratic institution in Japan itself is under attack. And so they think that their priority is to protect democracy in Japan before supporting other countries.
Okay. There are a few questions about Donald Trump in particular and his effect on US-Japan politics. So given Trump's lack of commitment to democratic norms around the world or at home, do you think that it will force governments, in particular the Japanese government, to reevaluate the extent to which it highlights democracy or liberal values in its own foreign policy as a strategic decision?
Well, I cannot deny that possibility, but as I said, Japan has been reaching out to other democracies beyond the United States in recent years, and that includes mostly in India, Australia, and also other Western European countries. And although the democratic discourse might not really, you know, be accepted well by the Trump administration, but well, other countries, especially Germany and Australia, would place importance on this discourse of liberal values. And so in that sense, I think Japan would maintain this discourse.
Okay. Larry has another question about the mechanism of democracy promotion in Japan. So how exactly does Japanese either fund or supply resources for, you know, efforts to strengthen civil society and good governance in other countries? How much does it spend on political assistance, and through what kind of agencies and policies?
Thank you. Japan does not have quasi-governmental or non-governmental foundations like the US does. And so Japanese funding or all through, mostly through JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Japanese support goes to two major sectors. One is the rule of law, and another is state institutions for the for capacity building purposes of those state officials. And for example, for the sake of rule of law, Japanese judges and prosecutors and law scholars are dispatched to other, mainly Asian countries, to have dialogues with the local partners as to what kind of laws should be drafted, what kind of capacity building should be conducted. In addition to Japan Bar Association, Federation of Bar Association, that also sends more people for the rule of law systems. In the state institution sector, Japan sends Japanese government officials as counterparts to those recipient countries and conduct trainings.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Have there been any special issue areas that have emerged? You're getting a question, do you think Japanese democracy is the same as, well, it's asking basically if there's any support for, say, women's rights or any particular areas within human rights that Japan has become a leader on, or do you think that it's, you know, perhaps even better than some of the other advanced democracies?
The Japanese government claims that rule of law assistance is the area that Japan has an advantage compared to other Western countries out of its experience of receiving those legal assistance from abroad, Western countries like Germany and France, and incorporating it into Japanese law. And so that's what they claim. And Japan does provide assistance to gender issue, women's rights, but well, that's not necessarily like one of the major sort of sectors. The major sector, as I said, is the state institutions, capacity building, and the rule of law assistance. They think that well, their advantage is in good governance. Well, Japan has efficient and effective governance, and so that's what Japan can sort of export.
Okay, that's great. You mentioned in your talk, it was so interesting, this division within the citizenry between businesses and maybe more liberal voices. What has the role been of the business community now, particularly in an era of globalization? Have companies also been part of this kind of values promotion, or is it purely foreign policy?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The business community has been very hesitant in supporting democracy promotion. And that relates to the question related to China, especially. You know, business community is still very reluctant about you know, preaching China on democracy. But the Keidanren, which is the Association of Japanese Companies, has international cooperation division, which conducts training on how do you call it, employee relations. And so there's although that's not necessarily democracy promotion, but that's sort of similar to what AFL-CIO conducts from the United States.
Right. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Does Japan see an opportunity to counterbalance the One Belt, One Road initiative in China through its own infrastructure projects of the type that you mentioned before? This question is coming from Frank.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Japan has been well, trying to counterbalance to China's Belt and Road initiative. So Japan, well, FOIP is one of the strategies that was launched for that purpose. And another one is Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AAGC. That's also, that's supposed to be an infrastructure project conducted in Asia and Africa together with India. And they place importance on those governance norms such as transparency, openness, financial health in providing loans to recipient countries. And so they try to differentiate these AAGC and FOIP from China by emphasizing these governance norms. But at the same time, not only countering China's BRI, Japan in 2018 concluded what they call third country cooperation, which is that Chinese companies, Japanese companies, they get together to assist projects in third countries. And what Japan tries to do is to bring these governance norms such as transparency, accountability, and financial health in this third country cooperation scheme, so that Japan can make China learn about these governance norms and get used to, well, sort of help shape Chinese loan projects toward OECD sort of norms way.
That's interesting. Do you think that that's been an effective program?
Well, it's yet to see. There are too many variables. Well, China itself has been responding, in a sense, positively to complaints to BRI that China has been conducting debt diplomacy. That kind of criticism has been accumulated, and so China has been saying that it's not gonna. It's going to pay attention to the financial health of the recipient countries, but it's hard to say whether it's thanks to those country cooperation schemes.
Okay, we have a question from Alberto Diaz-Cayeros about China has a very active presence in Latin America, and some argue it's so it can control supply chains, particularly of commodities and raw materials. Have you seen the same kind of policies from Japan, or any similar criticisms?
Interestingly, I don't see Japanese initiatives of countering China's sort of presence in Latin America. Japan's interest is, of course, in Asia, but more than Latin America, Japan is interested in Africa, and that's that can be seen from, as I said, the Asia-Africa corridor. And that's probably related to the existence of energy. As a country that has to import energy from other countries, Japan would be interested in the direction that those energy-producing African countries goes.
Okay. There's a bit of a different question here. So we thought that you might get a question about COVID-19. This is a little bit different. Given that you just said Japan may use free trade as an area on which to establish leadership, what do you think the Japanese government might do in response to supply chain issues given the COVID-19 crisis? So much is dependent on the supply chain coming from China in particular. Do you think there will be calls for diversification or greater sort of a regional expansion of supply chains?
Yeah, there has been already calls for diversification of supply chains, but maybe I should say rather than diversification, it's more about nativization of supply chains, and so there's a very strong nationalist sort of sense shared amongst the public.
Okay. What lessons do you think other countries could learn from this experience of Japan's sort of evolving foreign policy priorities?
Well, I think especially other Asian countries face the same sort of situation where if they emphasize democracy, then they would face criticism from China and other fellow Asian countries. And so we've been trying to push those Asian democracies to create coalition to support democracy in the Asian region. And there has been always this discussion that in India, in Indonesia, in South Korea, or if we emphasize democracy and diplomacy, then they would feel that it would stimulate China too much. And so I think these countries could learn Japanese approach of diversified values promotion.
Okay, and do you think, this is, I guess, maybe a little further afield, but what do you think are the prospects for democratization in the region? I mean, we had the demonstrations last year in Hong Kong. Obviously, China is, you're right, a presence that makes other governments have to respond in kind, but given, you know, trends in the domestic level sometimes that are maybe a little bit vacillating about their commitment to liberal norms, what do you think, at least in the neighboring countries around Japan, are the prospects for transitions to democracy or more full-throated defenses of democracy?
I think, well, many scholars of democracy would share the same sort of concern that this current pandemic is making the decreasing the prospect of democracy consolidation and democratization furthermore, and it's been weakening democracy everywhere, including Asia. And there has been a very serious series of fake news laws enacted in all over Asia, and there has been restriction of moves with the use of IT tracking functions, with the use of smartphones and so forth. Recently, India made it mandatory to download these apps. And although South Korea has been considered to be a successful case of coping with COVID pandemic, but its use of this tracking function with the GPS and credit card record and surveillance cameras is a serious violation of privacy. And so, well, this has been very serious in the Asian region as a whole. And I think, well, in this sense, Japan should play a greater role in a sense that Japan does not stand out at all in the COVID-related talks, and that's because well, Japan does not strictly apply policies like Taiwan did, or South Korea did, or Singapore did. But that was because Japan, out of the past experience of constraints on civil liberties, Japan has been very hesitant about controlling people's moves, controlling media freedom, or tracking people's moves. And so, although I think the Japanese government is going to start testing tracking, Japanese version of tracking mechanism, but that's going to use Bluetooth. So it's not going to use GPS, and it's not going to violate your privacy. And so it's been, well, the country has been very paying serious attention onto civil liberties. But that's not really felt so deeply amongst the Japanese public and also the international public. So the Japanese government should explain their stance on related to these civil liberties, how they have been supporting it in order to sort of spread this message across Asia.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think that we have had a great discussion, learned a lot from your presentation. Really appreciate you joining us here today. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, we have a few remaining talks over the next few weeks before the spring quarter wraps up at Stanford. So we hope we'll see you in future sessions. And this whole event will be recorded and will be made available on YouTube later. Thank you so much, Maiko, for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maiko.
Thank you.